Welcome to Tough Justice. I'm your host, Donna Roman-Hernandez. We have a returning guest, Robert A. Bianchi, attorney at law, former prosecutor.
Hi, Donna. Thank you for having me back.
You're welcome, Bob. And also we have joining us today, David J. Bruno, also an attorney at law with the Bianchi Law Group.
Great to be here. Thanks for having us.
This is a tough time for law enforcement, Bob, so just let our listening audience know a little bit about your background before we get into the discussion at hand.
Sure, Donna. Well, I've had a very, very proud career, happy and honored career to first have started getting out of law school, being an assistant prosecutor in the Hudson County Prosecutor's Office for 7 years, where I handled all sorts of cases all the way up to and including homicide cases and death penalty cases for that office. It was a tremendous training opportunity. Hudson County was very active, and this is where we really learned and honed my trial skills. And I say honed my trial skills because my dad is 82 years old and he's still a practicing attorney.
That's
so
amazing.
I've been kind of cross-examined since I was like 5 years old, so I kind of learned a couple of things along the way. So that was pretty awesome. And then after that, I went into private practice actually with my father for 12 years, where I handled criminal defense cases, but wound up getting into a really niche area of the law and handling police brutality, official misconduct cases, excessive force, false arrest, malicious prosecution, and that's a federal and state civil crime. So I was doing criminal defense, but I was also doing cases where a few in the law enforcement community were creating a tremendous amount of havoc. So I learned a lot about police practices doing that. I think I became a little bit of an attraction, if you will, to the governor of New Jersey at the time when they were looking for a county prosecutor in Morris County. And because of my police practices background and balance with that, with my law enforcement background and my criminal defense experience, I was honored to be appointed and confirmed by the Senate to be the Morris County prosecutor, which I did for over 5 years. And that was just a tremendous opportunity from a policy-making point of view and working with the Attorney General's office. There's only 21 of us as chief law enforcement officers of each county, and we supervise all the local police agencies, which, by the way, in Morris County, you may be surprised, there are actually 44 law enforcement agencies in 39 towns. Wow. And I got out after that, and we did a very, very proactive community affairs piece in the prosecutor's office, intelligence-led policing. We really revamped with the consent and buy-in, if you will, from the local police chiefs and my own agency. We did some really tremendous things with that community outreach and internal affairs piece that you see right now in today's news, where not so many people are doing it, but now you kind of see that this may not have been a very bad thing to prevent the kind of activity we see now. I left that office and I had the honor and privilege to take with me my major crimes assistant prosecutor, fraud prosecutor, and he got a tremendous amount of experience handling police misconduct cases in the prosecutor's office, Dave Bruno, who's here with us. Me and Dave had an actual, if you give me, indulge me one moment,
sure.
I tried a homicide case when I was the county prosecutor, which a lot of people thought was very risky. It hadn't been done in over 20 years in Morris County and pretty much probably throughout the state. But I got the opportunity at that time to pick whoever I wanted to be my co-counsel. When I tried that case, it was a murder of a priest in Chatham, New Jersey. And out of all the lawyers I could have picked in the Morris County Prosecutor's Office, obviously I didn't pick one to fail. I picked one to succeed. I picked Dave. And so we've had a long relationship with one another, not only out of my respect for him as a trial attorney, but obviously the person I picked to try a case with me as prosecutor and now to be my partner.
Well, Dave, welcome to Tough Justice. Let our listening audience know a little bit more about your background.
Sure, appreciate it, Donna. I've been an attorney for a number of years, but most of my experience has been in the prosecutor's office. I was an assistant prosecutor, and most of my time was in the major crimes unit, where I not only prosecuted, but I also investigated major crimes. We were on duty so that when a call came in, we would respond out with law enforcement to the scene, make determinations as to what should be investigated, what should be collected. I was always a part of securing search warrants and working with the investigators to make decisions during the investigation. I had a tremendous experience there. I had a number of high-profile cases. I tried a case out of Randolph, two brothers, Jonathan and James Arati, that killed a 16-year-old girl, Jennifer Parks.
Oh, yes, I remember.
I was very fortunate to try that case as a 28-year-old. It really hit my heart as well because I actually grew up in Randolph. And so it was a case that I prosecuted in my home county, my hometown. with a police chief that was actually my DARE officer growing up.
Wow, how ironic
So
is that?
I take great pride in that case and many others. Another big case that I tried was with Prosecutor Bianchi, where Father Edward Hines was murdered in Chatham. I also have experience in the Internal Affairs Unit. So not only did I get that great experience in major crimes, but yeah, I worked in Internal Affairs, where cases were referred up from the municipalities, where officers and politicians were possibly accused of crime. So I worked with Internal Affairs in investigating those crimes and making charging decisions whether or not we would charge or send them back down to the municipalities. So listen, it's great to be here. Both Bob and I are certified trial attorneys, criminal trial attorneys by the New Jersey Supreme Court. There are a lot of attorneys out there. There are over 72,000 lawyers in the state of New Jersey, and there are only about 250 certified criminal trial attorneys that have been vetted by the New Jersey Supreme Court. So Bob and I are two of 250. And I would also note that Bob Bianchi is the only former head county prosecutor that's certified in the state of New Jersey.
Well, Prosecutor, I'm a big fan, as you know, of not only your knowledge, but of your insight. And this evening, prior to coming on the show, we were tossing about some ideas of where we want to go. And I just want to put it in the both of your hands tonight, because the amount of research that you've done, investigation and all of that, regarding the Brown incident. So I'm really just going to really allow the two of you to have a conversation with me, and I know our listening audience is going to find out so much that has not been said about this case, the facts. So Prosecutor, it's in your hands wherever you'd like to start.
Yeah, Donna. Okay, well, listen, I mean, we actually had and handled, and Dave was in the Major Crimes Unit at the time, a major high-profile shooting of a minority citizen in a white affluent community. And, there are some things you need to do as a law enforcement official and some things you definitely don't do. Because, as I wrote in the article that and you reviewed for my website, I wrote the title, and I think it was something to the effect that Michael Brown and Darren Wilson deserve better. Both people deserved better in what occurred in the Ferguson, Missouri case. And I wrote that article prior to the grand jury rendering its decision. And how was I able to do that? It's not because I have a crystal ball. It's not because I have some sort of Svengali understanding of things, other than I could tell from the way the investigation started from the beginning and the way the media was involved in the case and the lack of media ability of the police officers, that this investigation immediately took a turn in the wrong direction. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I mean and give Dave an opportunity to also chime in with regard to some things that he noticed when he was in Major Crimes. When we had our shooting, one thing that we were very proactive, and and you're very friendly with my chief, William Chavella, and I thought Billy was the best chief, with all due respect, in the state of New Jersey. And why? Because me and him both understood the value of solid and real community affairs. And I will tell you, there was a lot of pushback from the law enforcement community. That was the first unit I started. It wasn't there. And I started it because when I was being vetted for the job, this was a constant complaint. And I know from my police practices background, when I did civil rights work, that if the police and the community just dialogued a little bit more, you don't have to agree, but the mere fact that you're starting a relationship where there's communication, where you can bring issues to the attention of law enforcement if you think they're wrong, and just to be heard, many times will stop a lot of the anger and vitriol that occurs in these scenarios. Moreover, what I thought was a win-win for us was that once we started to gain these trusted relationships, we started gaining intelligence from the community.
Absolutely.
They were actually providing us data and information about their gang problem, their drug problem. And I would tell them all the time, we're not distrusted adversaries of yours. We are partners in our crime endeavor in order to make your community safe. And I say all this because that was done well before the shooting we had to deal with occurred. Those relationships weren't coming into my office. It was me going out to them. Going to me and Billy, going to and our staff of volunteers, of beautiful people. I love these people. Nights, weekends, going to churches and going to their festivals and honoring them in our own office for Black History Month, Hispanic History Month, or all the different ethnic groups. It was, first of all, a tremendous opportunity of spirit. To be able to have a platform to get out and get to know people. But when that shooting occurred, I left the scene, and the first thing I did was I told my chief, Billy, I want all the community leaders from the Black and Hispanic community that we've met in my office at 2 o'clock. And why did I do that? Because I knew where this could go. And I sat with them and I said to them, I'm going to dot I's, cross T's. Give me time to do the investigation. The media wants immediate information. I'm not giving it to them other than the basics. This is about the truth. It's not about the court of public opinion. Will you, who I've outreached to for so long, give me the opportunity to do my job? And afterwards, I will explain to you chapter and verse exactly how we went about it. They agreed, the police agreed, and we were able to have a calm, well-vetted investigation that when we went to the news conference and we laid out everything and the grand jury chose not to indict in that case, a decision that I completely agreed with. After it was all done, I turned around and you know this from the New York media standpoint, I asked the community leaders, does anyone have a question that has been unanswered? Not one question. So I think that this shows you the value of having those relationships from the beginning. Then, of course, and this is the piece that I'd like Dave to get into a little bit about the Brown case in particular, of course, it's not just about doing a good investigation. As important as the truth is the perception of truth.
Absolutely.
And when some inartful things were done in the beginning of that investigation, I have to be honest with you, when a body lies on the ground for 4 hours, when the officer is allowed to leave the scene and take his weapon with him that was involved in a police-related fatality, when a news conference is held and they release bad information about, quote unquote, the robbery or bad information about Michael Brown, but won't talk about what the police officer did, you set an incendiary stage where, of course, the community is going to look at those actions and say, you know what, we're not going to get a fair shot. And that started right from the very beginning of this case and never ended. Dave, do you have, what do you think about in terms of the what was done at the scene? Because you went over the grand jury transcripts and Don, we talked about this before, Don.
Yeah.
Of course, what prosecutors will look at ultimately when they get this investigation. I mean, we had an investigation here just before Dave goes with people without batteries for their cameras, without recorded statements being taken of critical witnesses, including Darren Wilson. Now, I don't know whether that was done nefariously or not. It doesn't really matter. The bottom line is it looks terrible. Now, we all know in law enforcement people make mistakes. We miss things. But some of this stuff was just basic things. Like, how do you not take an interview of the person involved in the shooting with a tape recorder in today's day and age? It just looks terrible. But ultimately, the prosecutors have to go to the grand jury. And I'd like to just dispel two things about the grand jury. It is not a place where I keep hearing people, they should have asked for an indictment. Prosecutors are by law not allowed to ask for an indictment. The grand jury is the check against police and prosecutors bringing bogus cases to trial. Prosecutors have an obligation to only bring cases they believe they can prove beyond a reasonable doubt, not just probable cause. So there's a lot of mixing up here of what the grand jury process is. And when you talk about that, people seem to keep forgetting, those who are yelling about the process, and I understand this controversy, but Darren Wilson was a defendant in the grand jury process. He was not a police officer.
That's such an important point that you raised, prosecutor.
It's unsettling to me. It is intellectually dishonest for people who typically advocate for a healthy grand jury process so that people are not held over for trial with all of the negativity that goes with that. Bail, getting a lawyer, fear, losing your job, concern about going to jail, having to go be publicly humiliated, have to try a case where you don't know if your liberty is going to be taken away from you. The grand jury is put into place to stop that from happening with bogus cases. And Darren Wilson, nor Michael Brown, nor anybody, whether you're black, white, Hispanic, tall, short, fat, skinny, whatever you are, a constitution of this country guarantees that Darren Wilson as a defendant is entitled to a fair presentation of evidence and only be held over for trial if you can establish probable cause and the prosecutor believes they can prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. So that was one major malfunction of people's thinking. The other one, shortly, is you cannot not produce information that helps a defendant in the grand jury process. There is case law in each state that if you fail to produce information that's favorable to the defendant, the judge will throw the indictment out of court. So these attacks that occurred with regard to the grand jury process were specious, in my opinion, intellectually dishonest by those who know the process, or just ill-informed by those who don't know the process. Now, that said, there were issues with that presentation, and Dave can talk about those that were really, really wobbly. But I don't think it would have changed the result. It just showed to me, to be honest with you, Donna, a little bit of amateur hour in this whole thing.
You know, Donna, there's another thing, that this prosecutor was criticized for presenting all of the evidence. In essence, he called all of the witnesses that had anything to say about this case. He provided prior statements in the form of both prior statements to the detectives of the county as well as to the federal government, and even accounts to media. And that is something he has been criticized about, which I know Bob and I both agree with what the prosecutor did. I think he gave both Darren Wilson and the victim in the case a fair opportunity so that the grand jury heard it all and made their own determination. You know, I recently reviewed the statement that the prosecutor made after releasing his decision. And one of the things that really jumped out at me is when he talks about the objective evidence, the physical evidence that the grand jury heard. And it's really important because, as we all know, there were varying accounts of what happened on that day.
Right.
There were accounts that Michael Brown was shot in the back. There were accounts that his hands were up and he was surrendering and he was shot. And then there are other accounts, like Darren Wilson, that Michael Brown had run away, had turned around, and started charging towards him in an aggressive manner. Okay, so what he did was he presented all of those accounts. He didn't discount one and let them hear everything. And when I say physical evidence, I think that's very, very important for everybody to understand, because the physical evidence didn't and does not lie. Okay, the physical evidence was there, it was collected, and it was important when looking at the differing versions of events, because one version is very, very clear when you really get down to the physical evidence. And I'd like to sort of frame this to start with Darren Wilson's version, if you would allow me.
Oh, absolutely.
Well, Darren Wilson was treating a sick child. He wasn't originally called out specifically to the Brown case or the alleged robbery.
Oh, so he was on a previous call.
He was on a previous call when the radio comes out and is reporting the grocery store incident, and they were looking for two males, and there was a description put out. So Darren Wilson, he wasn't driving around looking for those people and never asked to come into contact with Michael Brown. As he was driving, he saw two men walking in the middle of the street, and he pulled up to them and said, "Get on the sidewalk." Now, Michael Brown was with a friend. His name is Dorian Johnson. And at that point, Dorian Johnson says, "We're almost at our destination." And they did not get off the road or go to the sidewalk. Again, Wilson says, "Well, what's wrong with the sidewalk?" And Brown says, can I use obscenity on the show? Or
Yeah, you can.
He makes an obscenity.
Okay, so he says, "Fuck what you have to say."
So this is the response to the officer from Brown.
Exactly. Now, at this point, Darren Wilson does not put two and two together that these two individuals are related to the grocery store incident. Mm-hmm. So what he does is he actually angles his vehicle to stop them from walking forward. And he tries to open the door, and that's when what Darren Wilson says is Michael Brown takes the door and slams it into him. He's unable to get out. He's trying to get out of the car, and again, he tries to open the door, and Michael Brown slams the door back into him. Now, Darren Wilson's testimony is that there is a physical confrontation at that time where Michael Brown leans in and attempts to punch him with a full punch to the face. Mm-hmm. And this is really the first physical interaction that we hear from Darren Wilson, that there was an attempt to assault a uniformed police officer in a marked
In the
vehicle.
performance of his duties.
Absolutely. So, Darren Wilson was not able to get out of that car. Obviously now he's put in a very difficult situation where Michael Brown is now not letting him out and now is starting to strike him. So Darren Wilson testifies that he's being striked and he makes a decision to use constructive force. His intention to go to the weapon is not to shoot, but use it to try to get him off of him and put Brown back towards, away from the vehicle. So when he takes out his weapon, Brown grabs it. Now Brown is into the car reaching and grabbing, and Officer Wilson is saying that he's grabbing my weapon and telling me that you're too much of a pussy to shoot. Brown grabs the weapon to the point where it's now pointed at Darren Wilson's hip, and he is articulating fear that his weapon's going to be used against him, that he may be shot, and he testifies that he feels Brown's finger trying to go into a trigger guard. It's interesting because in his testimony, he says he tries to fire multiple times just to fire the weapon, but it doesn't fire. And we know now, after the firearms expert, that Brown most likely had his hand on the slide.
Slide, yep.
Okay, so Brown's hand is actually on the gun.
Which is a lot of force to stop that slide from moving.
Sure.
Pounds
And
of pressure.
So he tries 2 times to fire the weapon and he couldn't, and finally he gets a shot off. Okay, we know that there are 2 shots that are fired at the vehicle.
Within the vehicle?
Within the vehicle or near the vehicle, okay? Because we know because of the casings.
Right.
There are 2 casings that are found.
Found outside.
What's also really important with respect to the autopsy report is that Michael Brown had an injury on his hand. That injury was indicative of a close contact wound. There were multiple medical examiners that testified, and they all really agreed that the first wound was to the hand because of the soot that was placed on Michael Brown's hand.
Absolutely.
So we know that Michael Brown's hand was right by that gun, in front of the gun, close to the gun. We know this is a close contact shot. What's also interesting about the physical evidence here is that round goes through the door. And I know Bob believes this is really important because no trained police officer is intending to fire in close quarters in a vehicle through a door. That is certainly, there's a stress there, and Officer Wilson is responding to that stresses. In addition, there's also DNA evidence that's in the car that's indicative that thumb injury, that hand injury, the shot was in the car, because we have Michael Brown's DNA on the side of Officer Brown's interior.
Well, David, this is like a play-by-play we're getting here today, prosecutor. And I want to let you know, we just have about a minute before we're going to go to break, and so I think we're going to keep our audience in suspense. Unless, prosecutor, you want to make a couple of comments before we go to break.
I just like, as Dave goes through this, I think that one of the big parts missing in this whole thing is that I went through the police use of force training myself and firearms training.
I know you did.
And until you understand how police officers are trained, Dave used terms like constructive force. We use terms, Donna, you know this, the continuum of force, right, and how you escalate force. And if officers are responding pursuant to their training, if you don't know the training, then you can't make a determination as to whether or not it was appropriate or inappropriate. But Dave mentioned to me the biggest point right now up to where we're at. Him shooting through that door is not a favored practice. You know, as a police officer, firing a weapon in that condition could cause danger to yourself. Definitely. It's what I refer to as the desperation shot, clearly evidencing that the violent encounter led this officer to believe his life was in danger. Otherwise, he would not have shot, rather than getting a clear shot through the window if he felt he was... Finally,
a voice of sanity we have right here on Tough Justice. Thank you so much for that, prosecutor, because with all the talk that I've seen on TV, other than when you're on, of course, and you and David are on, it's always good, on our major networks, media networks, finally, speaking from the training perspective, it just sheds so much light. So we're going to take a short break for a word from our sponsors, and we'll be back very soon again with Prosecutor Robert Bianchi and also Attorney David J. Bruno.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome back to Tough Justice. I'm Donna Roman-Hernandez. You're listening to ddvradio.com, and we are Tough Justice, the pro-law enforcement voice of talk radio. Returning with my guest, Prosecutor Robert A. Bianchi, the Bianchi Law Group, and also legal analyst, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. And also with David J. Bruno. I'm so impressed when you said at the age of 28 you were doing all this trial work, an attorney, and also formerly with the Morris County Prosecutor's Office.
Thank you.
Prosecutor, I'm always in awe of your skills. And when I saw you on TV last week, I was like, wow, what a great legal analyst, finally. Sanity.
Oh.
Tell us a little bit more about that. And I know, David, you also have an upcoming guest appearance.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to be on Fox News, I think, on the 24th.
Wonderful.
Depending on, something could always pop up, obviously, but Bob's scheduled on the 25th coming up. But
Let me know a little bit more about that, Prosecutor.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that I really love about being back out in private practice right now is that Dave and myself have a unique insight into how prosecutors and police operate, which, because as Dave said, he was involved and I was involved in every investigation that went on, with our background with civil rights and all the areas. In my opinion, respectfully, nobody knows police misconduct cases or police cases or prosecution better than myself and Dave do. And I'm really proud of the fact, I guess that's getting recognized on a national level, because we've done a number of, I've been on Fox probably 6 times. I was on Bill O'Reilly last week, and we've been getting calls, and Dave as well, to be legal analysts. And why I love that is because sometimes when you're watching, if you love what we do, the spiritualness of being a trial lawyer, and I look at it as a spiritual practice, and you have a passion for it, and you see people getting on TV making all sorts of incendiary comments and talking about how prosecutors do their jobs or whatever, who never walked into a courtroom, you get really angry, because it's not only, again, intellectually dishonest, it's ill-informed, misinformed, and so much lack of information and proper information and vetting of data and training and how we work and what grand juries are for and how police are trained causes, as you saw in this particular case, a narrative that starts to get created in the public opinion. People start picking sides. We live in a country where everybody's blaming and pointing fingers, and there's hatred, and there's only Democrats versus Republicans and police versus community. And we really need to take this opportunity to slow down, to speak with kindness and with professionalism and with meekness and with intelligence and knowledge about what we're talking about, because both sides are right and both sides are wrong. And only when serious people who have knowledge walk into the room and educate can you ever come to effective places. I look at the Michael Brown case as sad as I'm saddened that the young man was shot and killed. I'm saddened for Darren Wilson. We can sit here and play the who's right, who's wrong game back and forth, and that's fine. We should test our police officers, giving them guns and giving them badges. And there are temperamentally unfit police officers that need to be removed from the job. I'm all for that, but I'm also for when our police officers are putting their lives on the line and they have to take an aggressive action, that they're fully committed and supported. So the media has apparently been looking at us as being a reasonable, straightforward, respected voice of people who know all sides of these issues. And I love doing that, because it's really, I think, a service to the community to have people like myself and Dave at least giving them a viewpoint that we believe to be the real deal, not just the hyped up, amped up, mediaized public opinion piece.
Well, you lived it.
Sure.
Your reputation is stellar.
Listen, I've prosecuted cops.
I know you have.
I was aggressive with bad police officers. We instituted internal affairs practice, early warning detection systems, all based on my civil rights experience. The police officers knew I was firm but fair. But then again, when officers made judgment calls that could go sideways sometimes, we all know that in hindsight, that were operating from a good heart, that were following policies and procedures, with me, you can expect to be fully supported under those circumstances. You can't have rhetoric out there with people saying, I taught to my children to be distrustful of the police. No, you should be having conversations with your children about, my mother told me to look both ways before I crossed the street. that if I got hit by a car, it's not the car's fault, it's my fault for not seeing it. My mother taught me not to commit crime. My mother taught me that when a police officer pulls you over, no matter how angry you are, to be respectful. I put my window down. I turn my lights on. I put my hands on the steering wheel. I say, yes, sir, no, sir. These are basic things that we are not teaching our children. When we are teaching our children to be distrustful of police, and I'm talking about painting police with a broad brush of being bad, is as discriminatory as it is when people from a minority community say that just because a couple of people that are, committing crimes, we don't paint the whole community as being criminals. But yet for some reason that same love and understanding doesn't translate to police officers in scenarios where an officer may do something that's ineffective or do something wrong, if that makes sense to you.
Oh, it does make sense to me. As I said before, your reputation is stellar, and the insight and the facts that you're imparting here today are so important to the national discussion.
Certainly. And you know what? One last thing, Donna.
Sure.
Something that I think is one of the biggest problems that we've had. Police need to do a better job at community relations. Police need to do a better job at policing themselves. We can all agree with this, and anybody who's been in the business knows this to be true. But what is really disconcerting too is that we need people that are in positions of power. I mean real power. The people that are putting people in the room that can make effective change. Michael Brown and Eric Gardner cases can be resurrection moments for this nation, where we can actually get to a place where we can have effective and fair and law enforcement that also operates constitutionally. It's an opportunity. Hopefully that opportunity won't be wasted in the hatred, in the vitriol, and the people who are calling themselves leaders, who are taking sides when there's really truth in the middle of all these things. What we need are people in the room that know the business. We don't need political appointments any longer of people who don't have experience. We don't need people who have economic gain. We don't need people who are looking to increase their platform based on hatred and vitriol in order to be able to make money. What we need is real people that have lived this job, who have passion for this job, who have passion for the community, passion for the police, passion for prosecution, who recognize there's good and bad in each of those areas, that can come to the table and affect positive change. It can be done, but it starts when people at the top levels of government put the right people in the room.
Well said. You have my support.
Thank you.
So David, before we went to break, you were breaking it down. I mean, it just made so much sense to me. I didn't know all the facts as I know them now. So continue on with your narrative about it.
Yeah, I will tell you that there really is not much dispute about what happened at the car. The witnesses generally were consistent that Michael Brown was at the vehicle, partially in the vehicle, and there were 2 shots at the car. Mm-hmm. After the 2 shots, both Dorian Johnson and Michael Brown, they started to run away from the car. And it took Darren Wilson some time. He didn't immediately chase after. He probably was a little shooken by what had happened in the vehicle. And he got out of the car and started to chase after Michael Brown. Dorian Johnson, he sort of hid behind a vehicle. He was out of the picture. And as Darren Wilson got out of the car, he started to run towards Brown, who had a head start in front of him. Now, I want to get into Darren Wilson's testimony, and I'm gonna read from it, okay? Because at some point, Wilson's yelling to Brown, "Stop, stop, stop." Okay? And Brown does stop. There is a good idea of where Brown did stop, because witnesses have a particular point on the street where a road intersects with Canfield. Here's what Wilson says. He turns, he looked at me, he made like a grunting, like aggravated sound, and he starts. He turns, and he's coming back towards me. His first step is coming towards me. He kind of does like a stutter step to start running. When he does that, his left hand goes into a fist and goes to his side. His right hand goes under his shirt in his waistband, and he starts running towards me. As he's coming towards me, I keep yelling him to get to the ground. He doesn't. I shoot a series of shots. I don't know how many I shot. I just know I shot. I remember having tunnel vision on his right hand, that's all. I'm just focusing on that hand when I was shooting. After the last shot, my tunnel vision kind of opened up. I remember seeing the smoke of the gun, and I kind of looked at him, and he's still coming at me. He hadn't slowed down. At this point, I start backpedaling, and again, I tell him, get on the ground, get on the ground. He doesn't. I shoot another round of shots. Again, I don't recall how many it was or if I hit him every time. I know at least once because he flinched again. At this point, it looked like he was almost bulking up to run through the shots. Like it was making him mad. I'm shooting at him. And the face, he was looking straight through me. I wasn't even there. I wasn't even anything in his way. Wilson then explained how the encounter finally ended by testifying, he still keeps coming at me, gets about 8 to 10 feet away. Wilson was backpedaling, quote, pretty good, because I know if he reaches me, he'd kill me. And Brown, quote, had started to lean forward as he got closer, like he was going to just tackle me, just to go right through me. At this point, Wilson looked through the sight of his gun and, quote, all I saw was Brown's head, and that's what I shot. Now, what's really important here in this part of the testimony is that Officer Wilson is testifying that Brown is coming after him. And it's interesting because he shows that Brown almost got into like a tackling position when he's leaned over coming towards him. I want to contrast that to Dorian Johnson's testimony and statements that he made. Okay, Dorian Johnson was the friend that was with Michael Brown.
Who was hiding?
He was hiding, and he says he saw what happened, okay? And this is really where this hands up narrative comes, okay? Hands up, don't shoot. And we see this now in the protest, on signs, yes, and everywhere, even on shirts, right? Well, in a August 12th version to a local television station, Dorian Johnson said, and let me be clear too, Dorian Johnson says first that Michael Brown was shot in the chest at the car, which is disproved by the evidence, okay, because the actual chest wound is downward as if the gun was above the head going down towards the feet. Okay, that was disproven. And also, Dorian Johnson originally said that Michael Brown was shot in the back twice. That was also disproven by the autopsy report. There are no injuries, there are no gunshot wounds to the back of Michael Brown. So, August 12th, he gives an interview to a local television station, and he says, after he describes being shot in the back, my friend stopped running. His hands immediately went in the air, and he turned around towards the officer face to face. He started to tell the officer that he was unarmed and that you should stop shooting me. Before he could get his second sentence out, the officer fired several shots into his head and chest area. Okay, so essentially what Dorian Johnson is saying is there's no charging, there's no movements to the police officer. Basically, he puts his hands up, he says stop shooting, and then the officer shoots and kills him in the head and the chest. Before the grand jury, Dorian Johnson says, the prosecutor asked Johnson whether Brown was running towards the police officer as he was finally shot. Johnson answered, he couldn't get a step off. And now he's talking about this area where the intersection of the road and the two roads. The prosecutor clarifies, and here's the question. And then he doesn't proceed towards the officer? No, ma'am. So from the time he turned around, he did not proceed towards the officer? Answer, no, ma'am. Okay, so there's clearly this contrast, right? It's absolutely a different version from Officer Wilson's version, where there's a charge, and Dorian Johnson's testimony, where it's hands up and he's shot and killed.
Shot in the back, right? And then turns around and shot in the front. Is that not right, Dave?
That's correct.
Right.
But he's also hiding.
Yeah, I mean, but let's be very candid here. Prosecutors are looking for witnesses. Judges will charge a jury at the end of the case. When you're evaluating the credibility of the witness, did their story make sense? Was their story consistent? Did they maintain the same story? Was the story shown provable by forensic evidence or other objective means. I'm not making it up. That's the law that the judge reads to a jury.
Right.
And what you have right here from a prosecutor's standpoint, remember, the media bought into this narrative, hands up. Of course we all agree, if he was submitting and had his hands up and the officer shot him, the officer should be in jail. The question is that everybody bought into that, from Dorian Johnson, who I submit, with all due respect, that a court of law would say this to a jury. You have to evaluate his credibility based on his participation in this. What prior record, if any, he has in terms of affecting his credibility, any motive, bias to lie, opportunity to view, and how consistent was his testimony with other witnesses and physical evidence produced to you in this courtroom. And you'll have to believe that testimony beyond a reasonable doubt, which is to a certainty that he's telling the truth. Now, when the guy comes in and says, Dorian Johnson, who this country bought lock, stock, and barrel, his story that this man's hands, Michael Brown's hands, were up and he was shot in the back, obviously a horrific portrayal, of course, if it were true. But it turns out that, in fact, it's not true, and Dorian Johnson can't even keep his story straight. Dave, I'm sorry, I digress.
Let's go back. Let's go back to the objective evidence, right? The physical evidence. So we have sort of like this stopping point. It's pretty clear from the witness's testimony, including Dorian Johnson, that Michael Brown gets to a specific part of Canfield at the intersection of Copper Creek Court. Okay, there's a point where, let's say, Michael Brown gets to. I will tell you that Michael Brown's body was not found at that intersection. So if you were to believe Dorian Johnson and hands up, shot and killed, Michael Brown should be right there at the intersection of Copper Creek Court and Canfield.
I see you have a diagram there too?
Yeah, I have a piece of evidence that was presented to the grand jury. It was done by law enforcement of the evidence that was collected.
Wow.
Okay, and where this is important is the relationship of that intersection where Michael Brown stopped and where Michael Brown's body was found face down. Okay, I will tell you, his body was 48 feet 2 inches from that intersection.
Whoa, that's quite a distance.
48 feet 2 inches from that intersection. So if he were to have turned around, put his hands up, and was shot and killed right there, the body would be 0 feet from the intersection.
Definitely.
Okay? So there's movement. What's also important to note is there were two areas where blood was found on the road. Okay? So I will tell you, it's in between the place where Michael Brown's body was found and in between the point of Copper Creek Court where he stopped. Okay, so what that shows is additional movement. Even if we can't believe the witness testimony that Brown's body got all the way to Copper Creek Court, I will tell you that there's an exhibit 19 and 20, two blood drops in the street, and there's substantial blood trails. They're not just little drops. The DNA was done. It's Michael Brown's blood. Okay, and even that, if you just discount the Copper Creek intersection, the blood trail shows that Michael Brown had to move and I will say charge, but move towards Officer Wilson at least 22 feet. The blood will show 22 feet of movement. The witness testimony shows 48 feet of movement towards Officer Wilson. The blood evidence shows at least 22. Okay, so that's really substantial. Now, what's also substantial is the injuries to the body. There were 6 gunshot wounds to Michael Brown. And what's very, very interesting is these 3 wounds to the upper body, okay? We'll talk about a gunshot wound to the vertex of the head. That's in a downward pathway. And when I say downward, I am talking about the top of the head to the feet in a downward motion.
Okay.
So if somebody's standing up straight with a downward injury, you would have to put a gun on the top of their head and shoot down towards their feet. Okay? Michael Brown had 3 substantial injuries in the downward angle. It was the vertex of the head, the forehead, and the chest. Okay, what that is consistent with is the bending. Okay, it's also consistent with the charge, the charge that we heard from Officer Wilson. I want to go to the one additional witness that was presented to the grand jury, witness number 10, and he too had an account of what he saw. Okay, this is not Dorian Johnson, who may have a motive with the Michael Brown side, and it's not Officer Wilson. This is witness number 10. Okay, witness number 10 says he, referring to Michael Brown, stopped. He did turn. He did some sort of body gesture. I'm not sure what it was, but I know it was a body gesture. And I say, could I say for sure he never put his hands up after he did this body gesture? Wait, strike that, and this is important, obviously. And I could say for sure he never put his hands up after he did the body gesture. He ran towards the officer full charge. The officer fired several shots at him to give an estimate. I would say roughly around 5 to 6 shots was fired at Michael Brown. Michael Brown was still coming towards the officer, and at this point I'm thinking, wow, is this officer missing Michael Brown at this close range? Michael Brown continuously came forward in the charging motion, and at one point, he started to slow down and he came to a stop. And when he stopped, that's when the officer ceased fire. And when he ceased fire, Michael Brown started to charge once more at him. When he charged once more, the officer returned fire, I would say, give an estimate 3 to 4 shots, and that's when Michael Brown finally collapsed. With regard to the body gesture, witness 10 explained, all I know, it was not a surrendering motion of I'm surrendering, putting my hands up or anything. I'm not sure. If it was like a shoulder shrug or pulling his pants up, I'm not sure. I really don't want to speculate. But immediately after he did the body gesture, he comes full force, full charge at the officer.
I think something. Look, these are very detailed facts, and
very
I know we need to.
facts.
We're getting close to the end of the show,
Yes.
and we need to wrap this up. Dave also brought out something that I thought was extraordinary. Listen, we weren't in the grand jury. It's meant to be a secret proceeding, so people like this can come in anonymously and not have to worry about reprisal. But there's also audio tape of these shots occurring, which completely supports what this witness that Dave just read to you. Boom, 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 stop. And then a couple of seconds later, boom, 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 boom. This is the actions of somebody, as you know, as an officer that, and consistent with what Darren Wilson said, consistent with what this witness said. It's never changed the story. Didn't admit to lying like many of the other witnesses. Didn't admit like other witnesses that they weren't even there, even though they said they were. And witnesses in the grand jury that admitted that they only stated things when they weren't there because the community wanted them to say things. Here's the wrap up to this. Prosecutors are required to bring cases that can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt with credible witnesses. The forensic evidence in this case completely supported what Darren Wilson said, as well as what other witnesses said that were at the scene that were from the community. You could never prove a case beyond a reasonable doubt based upon this, regardless of what happened. If these witnesses came in and lied, shame on them. If they changed their story because they felt pressure from the community, shame on them. As a prosecutor, forget about the Michael Brown case. We would call it a leaky bag garbage if we were trying to prosecute a case beyond a reasonable doubt. We live in a country with a constitution. Many times that constitution protects minorities just like it does Darren Wilson. Are we supposed to have a grand jury process where we take garbage testimony with forensic evidence that objectively show that these statements are lies? That blood doesn't lie, doesn't have motive, doesn't have bias, doesn't have an opportunity to fabricate. That blood shows he's moving back towards Darren Wilson, just like the statement was. However, unfortunately in our country, politicians pandered. Political people in the media allowed this case to be a lightning rod for whatever political platforms they were on. Be damned with the physical evidence. Be damned with people that lied. Is this how they'd like to be judged if they were accused of a crime? Is this what our Constitution requires, is that we take people to trial and just kind of throw it up against the wall and let whatever happens, happens? No, that's not the way we have our system, nor would anyone be held accountable for that. It's based on real evidence, real people, real stories, support it and that can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. If we break those constitutional protections for Darren Wilson, we've broken them for us all. And then our Constitution is merely a piece of paper, and we become no different than every totalitarian government that caused us to write that document in 1776 that protects us all the way to this day. And it saddens me to listen to people who supposedly advocate on behalf of civil rights like I did for cops who really do things that are wrong, to then go and just want to abandon a grand jury system and constitutional system and just indict them and let them stand trial. Would we really say that is the way we want this message to be? It's a shame that that happened to Michael Brown. We all agree with that. But you know what? We have to have some accountability in this situation too. 5 minutes before this, Darren Wilson was saving a child. Michael Brown was committing a robbery. People say, what's the relevance of that? That would have been admitted in evidence in a court of law to show motive, to show that he was fleeing from the police because he was afraid he was going to be captured for having committed a robbery. So these are very, very relevant facts that would be produced to a grand jury. And if that prosecutor, Mr. McCullough, did not present those facts, any indictment against Darren Wilson would have been reversed and thrown out of court in a heartbeat. The grand jury system is there as a check and balance to us as prosecutors. The citizens get to ask questions, and these grand jurors did. I suggest one thing. Anyone who critiques what this grand jury did, and there were some problems with the presentation that we could talk about on another show. I don't think they would have affected the outcome. But you know what they should do? Instead of yelling and screaming before you go back out there and believing these narratives that are just provably false, read the testimony at least. We ask questions of people that have very strong opinions. Did you read the testimony? They haven't even read it, but they have an opinion about it.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. I will tell you, the testimony, it's 24 volumes. There are over 200 pages. I will tell you, I don't know how anybody could comment on this case without reading the evidence.
I'm going to give you a little prosecutorial thing from the head guy. Let me tell you what happened here in a nutshell. He didn't believe there was probable cause the prosecutor to bring this, to charge him and to bring him to trial with proof beyond a reasonable doubt, which is his ethical obligation. So he gave it to the grand jury when he didn't have to, because of all the public pressure and all the media. He gave it to them to let them make a decision. And let me suggest to you this, because we've seen this happen. If the grand jury wrongly indicted him and he had to stand trial and the case wasn't proven beyond a reasonable doubt, they'd be yelling and screaming and rioting in the streets about that. There's no winning sometimes, but this prosecutor did not believe there was enough evidence and gave them an opportunity with the grand jury that most people don't have an opportunity to have.
Well, one more thing, if I can, which is tremendous from the transcript. The grand jurors actually asked the prosecutor's office, the people presenting the case, if they can release a statement with their decision. They had a concern that there would be doubts about their decision. Unfortunately, the law prohibited it. But it would be unbelievable to hear from those grand jurors as to the rationale as to why they did not true bill.
Yeah, we don't accept votes anymore. I'm wondering, Donna, where are we going with this? Let's take it to the next step. I don't agree who gets elected the next president. So, as far as I'm concerned, he's not the next president. Voting in our system, as imperfect and flawed as it is something that needs to be respected. If things need to be changed, let's change them. You have to use this as a positive dialogue about bringing the community and the police together rather than wedge politics that are dividing and separating them. It can be done. We did it in Morris County. We can do it in the nation.
Well, I'm ready to go. I'm all charged up. Well, we've come to the end of the show, but definitely not the end of a discussion. So you're more than welcome to come back. I know you're so busy with all the commitments that you have, but you always have a home here on Tough Justice.
We love you, Donna. Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Robert Bianchi, former prosecutor, Morris County, and also David Bruno. It's just amazing that we can solve issues right here in the studio, and there's so much discourse on the outside. So thank you for bringing us all together tonight for the forensic evidence, for the testimony that you've read from, and always, Bob, thanks just for being a great friend and available to the community when it needs you most.
Anytime, Donna. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So tune in every Saturday at 5 p.m. for another episode of Tough Justice, www.toughjusticedddv.com. We are the pro law enforcement voice of talk radio. Thank you.